In rural USA, America's most inbred lineage. The uncle who had children with all his nieces. Hidden away from the scrutiny of the outside world, in the secluded valleys of Appalachian, Kentucky, there existed a family whose bloodline became so entangled it created one of the most disturbing genealogical records in American history. A haunting example of what happens when isolation, poverty, and a distorted sense of family loyalty combine. The Blackwood family's story, beginning in 1892, created a legacy of genetic devastation. The patriarch of this troubling dynasty was Jeremiah Blackwood, born in 1872, a man whose shadow would be cast over 3 generations. When our story truly begins in 1892, Jeremiah had already established himself as the undisputed authority on the family's remote homestead. Nestled deep within the mountains, where outsiders rarely ventured and local authorities seldom interfered. What made the Blackwood case particularly disturbing was the systematic nature, not just the fact that consanguineous relationships occurred, with which Jeremiah, then a 30-year-old man, began to control the reproductive future of his family line. This followed the death of his brother Samuel in a mining accident in 1891. Assuming guardianship of Samuel's 5 daughters, Mary, Elizabeth, Catherine, Hannah, and the youngest, Josephine, who was only 7 years old at the time, Jeremiah took control. It was a different time, explains Dr. Margaret Wilson, a historical anthropologist who has studied isolated communities in Appalachia for over 20 years. These mountains created not just physical barriers, but cultural islands where families developed their own codes of conduct, often disconnected from the larger society. Even by these standards, the Blackwoods were extreme. The first indication that something was terribly wrong came in 1900 when the eldest niece, Mary, then 18, gave birth to a son. Discovered decades later in a county historical archive, local midwife records noted concerns about the child's father, but in the isolated community, such questions were seldom pursued. A daughter with noticeably poor health from birth was born by the second niece, Elizabeth, 2 years later. By 1906, all 4 of the adult nieces had born children, and medical records from a traveling doctor who occasionally visited the region noted that all of these children displayed concerning physical characteristics: stunted growth, facial asymmetry, and in 2 cases, cognitive development issues that became apparent as they aged. What we know now about genetics explains the devastating patterns seen in the Blackwood children, says Dr. James Thompson, a geneticist at the University of Kentucky. When closely related individuals have children together, recessive genetic disorders become dramatically more common. The human genome contains many harmful mutations that normally remain hidden, but consanguinity brings these mutations to the surface. The most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood story wasn't revealed until 1912 when a school teacher, Miss Eleanor Palmer, began asking questions about the unusual number of children with similar physical features and the same surname attending her one-room schoolhouse. Initially dismissed by local authorities who were reluctant to interfere with family matters, her concerns persisted, and she kept detailed records of her observations. The children would not speak of their home life, Miss Palmer wrote in her diary, discovered by historians in 1978, but their physical similarities were unmistakable, as were their developmental challenges. When I inquired about their parents, they would only say they lived with Uncle Jeremiah and the mothers. Prompted by Miss Palmer's persistent reports to county officials, it would take another 3 years before outside authorities finally intervened. When they finally investigated the remote Blackwood property in 1915, they discovered a compound where Jeremiah had effectively created his own isolated society. By this point, he had fathered at least 12 children with his nieces, creating a genetic nightmare that would affect generations to come. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. These are the stories mainstream history books have deliberately erased from our collective memory. You won't find these untold histories of America's darkest family secrets anywhere else. As investigators would later describe it, the Blackwood compound was situated in a remote hollow accessible only by a narrow dirt path that became nearly impassable during the winter months. The family subsisted through a combination of hunting, small-scale farming, and occasional work Jerem would take at distant logging operations, which left the women and children alone for weeks at a time. What authorities discovered in 1915 was a household structure that defied conventional family arrangements. The 4 adult nieces, Mary, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Hannah, each occupied separate cabins clustered around a central larger structure where Jeremiah lived. The youngest niece, Josephine, now 31, lived in Jeremiah's cabin. Between them, they had produced 17 children, all fathered by Jeremiah, creating a family tree that folded back upon itself in a genetically disastrous pattern. Dr. Wilson explains, the Blackwood case represents an extreme example of what anthropologists call endogamy, marriage within a specific group. But this went beyond even the isolated mountain community's occasional cousin marriages. This was a deliberate attempt by one man to create his own lineage. The predictable consequences of close genetic relationships were suffered by the children born of these unions. Of the 17 children documented in 1915, 3 had died in infancy. Among the survivors, investigators noted that 12 displayed visible physical abnormalities, including facial asymmetry, unusually small heads, malformed limbs, and poor muscle tone. 9 showed signs of intellectual disability, ranging from mild to severe. The Blackwood children exhibited classic signs of what we now understand as inbreeding depression, explains Dr. Thompson. This occurs when harmful recessive genes, which would normally be masked by healthy dominant genes from unrelated parents, are expressed because both parents carry the same recessive mutations. The more closely related the parents, the higher the probability of this occurring. Perhaps most disturbing was the social structure that had evolved within this isolated community. The older children were taught to avoid outsiders and were kept from regular schooling, with the exception of the few Miss Palmer had managed to reach. They spoke with distinctive speech patterns and used unique terminology to describe family relationships that observers found difficult to understand. County records indicate that when authorities attempted to intervene, they faced not only Jeremiah's hostile resistance but also the reluctance of the adult women to leave the compound. A distorted sense of normalcy within the family system had been created by years of isolation and control. These women had been under Jeremiah's influence since childhood, notes Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a historical psychologist specializing in isolated communities. Their worldview had been entirely shaped within this closed system. What outsiders saw as exploitation, they had been conditioned to accept as their natural role in life. The case became further complicated when authorities discovered that the oldest children born to Mary, now in their teens, were being integrated into the same pattern of consanguineous relationships. The eldest daughter, Sarah, at 15, was pregnant, and investigators determined that Jeremiah was the father, making the unborn child both his grandchild and his child simultaneously. This revelation finally prompted decisive action. In February 1916, county authorities returned with court orders and removed all children under 16 from the property, 11 in total. The adult women initially refused to leave, though 2, Catherine and Hannah, eventually agreed to accompany their younger children. Jeremiah Blackwood was arrested and charged with multiple offenses under the laws of the time, though the concept of genetic harm due to consanguinity was not well established in legal frameworks. Court records show he was primarily prosecuted for violations of guardianship and child welfare statutes. The trial that followed in the summer of 1916 became a sensation in the region. Though it received little national attention as the country's focus was on the war in Europe, local newspapers described the case in vague terms, referring to unnatural family arrangements and improper guardianship, reflecting the era's reluctance to directly address intimate matters. The challenges of addressing consanguinity in early 20th century America were revealed in the 1916 trial of Jeremiah Blackwood. Legal frameworks were ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of such cases, focusing instead on more easily defined offenses like child endangerment and improper guardianship. The court records show a judicial system struggling with how to classify these offenses, explains legal historian Dr. Robert Jenkins. There was recognition that something profoundly wrong had occurred, but the language and legal structures to address it directly were lacking. Witnesses at the trial included county officials, Miss Palmer, the school teacher, and reluctantly, 2 of the nieces, Catherine and Hannah, who provided limited testimony. Their statements, preserved in court transcripts, revealed the normalized perception of their situation. "Uncle Jeremiah takes care of us all," Catherine testified. "He provided when no one else would. The children are family and family stays together." Medical experts brought in to examine the children presented evidence of their physical and developmental conditions, creating a record that would later become an important case study in early genetic medicine. Dr. William Foster, who examined several of the Blackwood children, noted in his testimony, "These children display consistent patterns of developmental abnormalities that cannot be attributed to poor nutrition or illness alone. The similarity of their conditions across different mothers suggests a common biological factor." The prosecution faced difficulties establishing Jeremiah's paternity through scientific means, as blood typing was primitive and DNA testing lay decades in the future. Instead, they relied on testimony about family structures and physical resemblances, evidence that would be considered circumstantial by modern standards. After a 3-day trial, Jeremiah Blackwood was found guilty on multiple counts of child endangerment and improper guardianship. He was sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary, though historical records indicate he served only 7 before being released in 1923 due to prison overcrowding and his deteriorating health. I witnessed this entire story unfold, and I cannot remain silent about the horrors inflicted on these innocent children. If you feel the same outrage I do about how these vulnerable young lives were destroyed, type justice for the Blackwood children in the comments. Let's ensure their suffering is never forgotten. The fates of the Blackwood children removed from the compound varied widely. Court records and social service documents from the era indicate that the younger children were placed with foster families throughout the county, while the older teenagers were sent to state institutions for feeble-minded youth, the terminology of the time for those with developmental disabilities. The foster placement of these children was complicated by their special needs and the stigma attached to their origins, explains Dr. Montgomery. Foster families were not equipped to handle their complex physical and developmental issues, nor were the institutions where some were placed. This was long before appropriate educational and therapeutic approaches had been developed. The children's integration into mainstream society was further challenged by the visible markers of their genetic conditions. Photographs from institutional records show distinctive facial features that made them immediately identifiable and subject to discrimination and ridicule. A grim picture of the children's outcomes is painted by follow-up reports by social workers throughout the 1920s. Of the 11 removed from the compound, 2 died within 3 years in institutional care. 6 remained permanently institutionalized. Only 3 managed some form of independent living, though all struggled with health issues and social adaptation. Mary and Elizabeth, the 2 oldest nieces, remained at the compound with their older children and eventually Jeremiah himself when he returned from prison. Josephine disappeared from records after 1918, with local rumors suggesting she fled to a distant city, though no confirmation of her fate has ever been found. The compound itself gradually declined as the original generation aged and younger family members increasingly sought contact with the outside world, particularly after rural electrification reached the region in the late 1930s, bringing radio and later television that opened windows to different ways of living. Far beyond the immediate children removed in 1916, the genetic legacy of the Blackwood family extended. The older children who remained at the compound, themselves products of consanguineous unions, continued to have children. Though historical records suggest they increasingly sought partners from outside the immediate family after Jeremiah's arrest brought unwanted attention to their situation. What makes the Blackwood case so significant from a genetic perspective is that we can trace the effects of consanguinity across multiple generations, explains Dr. Thompson. The genetic consequences didn't end with the first generation of children. They cascaded through subsequent generations in a pattern that geneticists call genetic load, the accumulation of deleterious mutations in a lineage. Medical records from the 1930s and 1940s show that even the children born to Blackwood descendants who had children with unrelated partners had higher than average rates of congenital disorders, developmental delays, and health problems. This pattern is consistent with what modern genetics would predict, Dr. Thompson adds. The effects of severe inbreeding can take several generations of outbreeding to dilute. By the 1950s, the Blackwood name had become so stigmatized in the region that many descendants changed their surnames. Local historian Martha Jenkins, who grew up in the county in the 1950s, recalls, "There was a saying, when I was a child, crooked as a Blackwood." People would use it to describe anything misshapen or not right. Most didn't even know the origin of the expression, but it persisted for decades. The site of the original Blackwood compound was abandoned in the late 1940s after Mary, the last of the original nieces, died. The land was eventually purchased by a timber company in the 1960s, and all traces of the settlement were erased. Today, only a small creek named Blackwood Run on some local maps gives any indication of the family's presence. The story might have faded entirely from historical record if not for the efforts of Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a genetic researcher who became interested in patterns of inherited disorders in Appalachian communities in the 1970s. While reviewing institutional records from the early 20th century, she discovered the case notes on the Blackwood children and recognized the significance of the detailed medical observations. What the doctors in 1916 recorded without fully understanding the genetics involved was essentially a case study in recessive genetic disorders, Dr. Simmons wrote in her 1978 paper on the case. The consistent patterns of physical and developmental abnormalities, the worsening of conditions in subsequent births, and the distinctive facial characteristics all point to classic manifestations of consanguinity effects. Dr. Simmons was able to track down 3 living descendants of the Blackwood family, grandchildren of the children who had remained at the compound. With their permission, she conducted what were then new genetic screening tests, confirming unusual patterns of genetic homozygosity, having identical copies of many genes, a telltale sign of inbreeding in a family tree. One of these descendants, identified in research papers only as Subject C, provided a rare first-hand account of growing up with the family legacy. "Everyone knew we were different," he told Dr. Simmons. "I had uncles who couldn't speak proper, aunts with hands that didn't work right. My grandmother would never talk about the old days, just said it was a different time and we weren't to speak of it." An important reference point in both genetic medicine and social history has since become the Blackwood case. Though the full names of descendants are protected in modern publications, medical textbooks have used the family's genetic history, with identifying details removed, to illustrate the mechanisms of recessive inheritance and the biological consequences of consanguinity. New dimensions were gained by the scientific significance of the Blackwood family history in the early 2000s when advances in genetic testing allowed researchers to identify specific recessive mutations that had become concentrated in the family line. A team from the University of Pennsylvania, working with anonymized genetic samples preserved from Dr. Simmons' earlier study, identified 7 distinct recessive mutations that had become homozygous, meaning identical copies were inherited from both parents in the Blackwood descendants. The Blackwood genetic samples provided a rare opportunity to observe the effects of extreme consanguinity in a human population, explained Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez, lead researcher on the 2004 study. "We identified mutations affecting skeletal development, neurological function, and metabolic processes that would normally be extremely rare in the general population, but became common in this family line due to the repeated consanguineous relationships." The study confirmed what earlier generations of doctors had observed without the tools to explain. The physical and developmental challenges faced by the Blackwood children were direct results of genetic inheritance patterns that concentrated harmful recessive mutations. Modern genetic counseling uses cases like the Blackwoods to explain the biological basis for laws and cultural taboos against close relative marriages that exist across diverse human societies. Almost every human culture has developed prohibitions against very close relative marriages, notes anthropologist Dr. Wilson. These taboos emerge not from an understanding of genetics, which is recent, but from observed patterns of outcomes over generations. The Blackwood case represents what happens when these protective cultural boundaries are systematically violated. Beyond the scientific implications, the Blackwood story raises profound questions about vulnerability, isolation, and the structures that allow exploitation to continue unchecked. Modern analysis of the case has shifted from viewing it merely as a genetic curiosity to understanding it as a failure of social systems to protect vulnerable individuals. This wasn't simply a matter of genetic misfortune, but of power, isolation, and the deliberate exploitation of vulnerable women and children in a setting where outside oversight was minimal. The legal response to such cases has evolved significantly since 1916. Modern laws against consanguinity are more clearly defined, and child protection systems are designed to intervene earlier and more effectively. Nevertheless, isolated cases continue to emerge, particularly in extremely remote or closed communities. In 2008, a distant Blackwood descendant, the great-granddaughter of Catherine, came forward after reading about her family's history in a medical journal. Choosing to remain anonymous in public but sharing her story with researchers, she described the long shadow the family history had cast. Growing up, we knew something was different about our family history, but it was never discussed directly, she recounted. There were whispers, sudden silences when children entered rooms. I had health problems doctors couldn't explain until I learned about my great-grandmother and the genetic legacy I carried. Understanding finally gave me a chance to make informed decisions about my own life. The Blackwood case remains a powerful example of how isolation, both geographic and social, can create conditions where exploitation flourishes and harmful practices continue across generations. It underscores the importance of education, community connections, and systems of oversight that protect the most vulnerable. For geneticists, the case offers important insights into human inheritance patterns and the biological mechanisms that make consanguinity harmful. For social historians, it illuminates the complex interplay of poverty, isolation, power, and exploitation in shaping family systems. And for ethicists, it raises enduring questions about responsibility, intervention, and the protection of those unable to protect themselves. If you've watched all the way through this disturbing historical account, please leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and understand who truly appreciates the in-depth historical investigations on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe for more hidden American histories that you won't find in traditional textbooks. Like this video if you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, and share it with others who appreciate learning about the darker chapters of our past that shaped modern understanding of genetics and social welfare. Both a scientific case study and a sobering reminder of what can happen when isolation and power imbalances allow exploitation to continue unchecked across generations, the legacy of the Blackwood family serves. In understanding their story, we better appreciate the importance of the social and legal protections that most take for granted today.